This content on the nervous system will be also a review of what you learned in anatomy and physiology. When we refer to the central nervous system or the CNS, we are referring to the parts of the nervous system that directly are part of the brain or the spinal cord. When we talk about the peripheral nervous system or the PNS, we're talking about nerves outside the spinal cord. And we will learn more about things specific to hand injuries or arm injuries that may affect the brachial plexus and cause problems for somebody in that peripheral nervous system. Be sure to review the anatomy of a neuron. A neuron is a nerve cell, and the cell has a body. It also has an axon and it has dendrites. We're going to spend some time taking a look at some pictures in class. Myelin is the fatty sheath that covers an axon. Now it is important to know that when an axon has more myelin, it actually increases the speed of transmission. So in something like multiple sclerosis, there is a loss of myelin, which actually creates a problem with speed of transmission and thus affects a person's ability to move. As we look at the central nervous system, we're going to know that there are some nerves in that central nervous system that come to and from the brain and the spinal column. Efferent nerves are nerves that move away. Those are your motor nerves. So the nerves that leave the brain and leave the spinal column to go out into other parts of the body to produce a motor movement are efferent. Afferent then are those that return to the spinal column and return to the brain with sensory information about things like pain or hot and cold. So afferent and efferent muscle or nerves are relate to specific sensory and motor nerves. As we remember the lobes of the brain, we have the cerebrum. The cerebrum has 4 specific lobes within it: your frontal lobe, occipital, parietal, and temporal. Review those and where they are and what their primary functions are. We'll review those in class. The brain stem is a very important part of the brain that actually controls respiration, heart rate. It controls your vital signs. Somebody who's had a brain stem stroke has a pretty significant problem and may not even survive it because it does directly affect the person's ability to breathe and the ability to pump blood effectively through their body. The brain stem is broken up into the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. The last portion in looking at lobes of the brain is the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is the portion of the brain that helps to control muscle coordination, tone, and posture. So these are things that are going to be significantly affected by an infarct or a stroke or some sort of a bleed in the area of the cerebellum. You see somebody who's had a cerebellar stroke, they are going to have some very specific problems with coordination, tone, and posture. Now we're going to spend some time talking about blood supply. I'll do some drawings on the board. When we think about blood supply to the brain, there is a middle cerebral artery, an anterior cerebral artery, a posterior cerebral artery, and then the basilar arteries, which produce blood supply to the medulla and the cerebellum. So somebody who's had a basilar artery stroke is going to have a stroke that affects their cerebellum and thus gives them some abnormal muscle coordination or tone. We will go through this in class. Some more review would be something you probably already heard about in your anatomy class, I hope, called the circle of Willis. And the circle of Willis is essentially a circle of arteries in the brain. Now, this is a really important thing for people who've had a stroke, because what the circle of Willis does is if somebody has had a stroke in a particular area of the brain, maybe there's some sort of a hemorrhage that's occurred, the blood can still reach the other side of that stroked area by traveling through the circle of Willis. And I will show some diagrams on the board, but the circle of Willis is really sort of like a fail-safe way to help people survive a stroke. It's really a unique and interesting thing. Cerebral spinal fluid is the fluid that surrounds the brain and fills the ventricles of the brain. Now, it is important because it provides a shock absorber. absorber. You learned in pediatrics that too much cerebral spinal fluid actually does have to be removed from the brain in the form typically of some sort of a shunt. Now, if there's not enough cerebral spinal fluid, what you end up with some potential trauma to the brain or spinal cord. White and gray matter is a way of interpreting the look of the nerve cells or the nerves in the brain in the spinal column. Those that are white are myelinated. So as I mentioned before, those that are well myelinated are going to have a faster speed of transmission. Here is some more review from A&P. In the brain, there are three layers of what is called meninges. You have the dura mater, which is the tough outer layer that covers the outermost part of the brain between the brain and the skull itself. The arachnoid mater is interprets to be called a spider, like an arachnid. And that's the middle layer. The pia mater then is the very delicate inner layer that supplies blood to the brain. So you have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. If you were to if you were to take those layers apart from each other, and you would be able to see them in a lab type of procedure. Cranial nerves. No need for you to memorize them. There are 12 pairs. If you know them, that's awesome. If you don't, there are three that you're primarily going to see associated with the muscles you're going to learn. Number 5 is the trigeminal. Number 7 is your facial nerve. And number 11 is the spinal accessory nerve. Now on to the peripheral nervous system and the spinal nerves. There are actually 31 pairs come out each side of the vertebral column. Now there are 8 cervical, which is confusing to some because there's only 7 cervical vertebrae. Okay, the 8 cervical vertebrae come out above each of the cervical vertebral bones. The first 7 come out over the top of the cervical bones. The 8th one actually exits below C7. So cervical nerve for C8 comes out above T1. There are 12 thoracic. So as then we move to the thoracic nerves, they come out below the thoracic vertebrae. There are 5 lumbar that come out below the 5 lumbar vertebrae. There are 5 sacral and 1 coccygeal, which align with each of those areas of the spinal column. Dermatomes is something that you're going to hear about when you learn about spinal cord injury in your lab in your lecture. These are areas upon the skin that actually have certain sensory fibers that translate to specific areas of the spinal column. So somebody who has been in some sort of an accident and has injury or trauma to their spinal column, we use testing of various dermatomes to determine exactly what areas are impaired. You'll again learn more about that in lab and lecture. Plexus. A plexus is a network of sensory nerves. We are going to focus on the brachial plexus. We're going to talk specifically about the brachial plexus because that is the network of nerves that serves the arm. And because we tend to focus on the arm so much in OT, that's the one that we're going to take a look at the most. We're going to do a lab exercise on the brachial plexus. However, there is the cervical plexus, which is above the brachial plexus, and then the lumbosacral plexus, which provides nerves to the trunk and to the lower extremities. Okay, the brachial plexus. This is important. There are 5 terminal branches. We are going to do an exercise in lab to show these to you. Axillary, musculocutaneous, radial, median, and ulnar. We will go over these in class. You will need to be responsible for knowing these and what portions of the body they serve to produce actions. As you're going to learn in your lecture and in your lab, it is very important to understand with somebody who has a spinal cord injury what that level of injury is, whether it's complete or incomplete, and it's going to have a dramatic effect on what you choose to do, whether you choose to issue adaptive equipment for something that has the potential not to ever sort of return, or whether you might be using a variety of different techniques to essentially exercise those areas that have been injured to prevent them from becoming atrophied so eventually they can function again. You'll spend some time talking about different spinal cord levels and what you need to know about those levels of the spinal cord that are going to tell you about what areas of the body the person is going to be able to use.